So tonight's event, I'm just really delighted that we have pulled this one together. So the title, I'm sure you realise, is called "Is There a Left Way Back from Woke?" I think it's probably the first event that we've done that directly addresses the question of what the left can do to address the problems that free speech is facing. And it's come about because Toby Young actually spotted Umut Ozkirimli's new book out. Umut's done a brilliant job of promoting it on social media and elsewhere. And Toby said, why don't we ask this guy if he will come and speak at a Free Speech Union event? And I did, and Umut got back to us straight away, which is great. This is his book. As you'll probably notice, it's on sale out there in the foyer, a very reasonable price. What's the price, Umut?
Well, I don't know the premium sale price.
I think it's 20.
Well, I think on foils it was £15.
Oh, don't say that. It's probably
so
20.
It must be cheaper there.
Anyway, even regardless of the price, it's a really, really excellent read, and I'm sure you'll want to read it after tonight. I should also mention the book that's just come out by one of our other panelists, Alice Sullivan, which is, where's that one gone? Okay. So I think lots of you will have this flyer for Alice's new book, Sex and Gender, a Contemporary Reader. And there's a really excellent promotional code that's on this leaflet that will give you a decent discount because it's an academically priced book, but academic quality as well. So really, it's getting really excellent reviews. So I recommend that you buy that as well. Okay, I'm now going to do this properly and introduce everybody. So as I said, we're really delighted that we've got Umut Ozkirimli joining us. He is Senior Research Fellow at the Barcelona Institute of International Studies. He's a professor at Blanquerna and a Senior Research Associate at CIDOB, which is the Barcelona Centre for International Affairs. He's the author of the acclaimed Theories of Nationalism, A Critical Introduction, and his writings have appeared, may not appear again, in The Guardian, a badge of honour nowadays, Open Democracy, the Times Higher Education supplement, which actually he's got a piece coming out tomorrow, he says, so he's not off their list. He's got a piece on cancel culture in academia in the Times Higher tomorrow. He's written for the Huffington Post, Al Jazeera, amongst many others. But the reason we obviously our ears pricked up was when we saw his latest book cancelled, The Left Way Back from Woke. So in a moment, Umut's going to spend sort of up to 10 minutes taking us through the main arguments of his book, and then we'll hear from our two other speakers. You may notice that this isn't Dr. Ashley Frawley. He wanted to, yeah.
Have I transitioned?
Well, we can do those jokes later. Alan Sokal is, I'm sure a lot of you will know. And if you don't know Alan by his face, you'll know him by his name. And if you were a student in the 90s, as I was, totally floored by postmodernism in the social sciences, you'll be very relieved to know that Alan's here because it was a great relief when he published in the 90s. His paper has become known as the Sokal hoax. If you Google that, if you don't know who Alan is, you'll find out more. He was the first to submit a hoax paper which kind of pulled the rug away from postmodernism, which was a huge phenomenon when that was published and became a real talking point. So Alan is now Professor of Mathematics at University College London, just around the corner, and he's Professor Emeritus of Physics at New York University. And he's one of the most powerful voices in the continuing debate about the status of evidence-based knowledge. He's co-author with Jean Brigmond of Intellectual Impostures, Postmodernist Philosophers' Abuse of Science, which was a follow-on from the original paper, and the author of Beyond the Hoax, Science, Philosophy and Culture. And Alan is so integral at the moment in the UK, and I'm sure in America as well, to the current struggles for academic freedom. So we're really delighted that he's here. And then on my far right there is Professor Professor Alice Sullivan. She's Professor of Sociology at the University of College London too, and Head of Research at the UCL Social Research Institute. You will have probably heard of Alice. She has made a real splash, not because she's a kind of a sort of storming publicity seeker, but just because her work has been so important in clarifying the need for sex-based categories across data collection in social sciences and also in government data collection as well. And she's referred to all the time as the person to go to on that particular question, in particular on the census and in other areas of government data collection. And she's also, really importantly, at UCL, along with other colleagues, has led the UK pushback in challenging the culture of no debate. And she's done that partly through organising really excellent events, but also through managing to encourage her employer to disaffiliate from Stonewall with an amazing success. I think, were you the first university to do that?
Mike, please. Mike.
Yeah, okay. We'll go into this in a minute. Okay, this is just me preambling. But an incredibly important marker that was put down by Alice and her colleagues doing that in a very kind of considered, a considered way. So that's been a real milestone in the regaining the ground for academic freedom. She's also on the advisory group of Sex Matters and the co-author of the new book, which I waved the flyer for, with Selina Todd, called Sex and Gender, a Contemporary Reader. So I'm now going to come to Umut and ask him just to give us his first thoughts, sharing his thoughts at the main arguments from his book, and then Alan and Alice will respond to those. So I'm going to give you a microphone. There you go.
Okay, shall we get a green light from there? Yes, I'm fine. Okay, well, I mean, I have to start by expressing my, what shall I say? I mean, I never thought I would be speaking at Free Speech Union. That's something. I mean, of course, I was going to start with the usual platitudes. Oh, thank you for inviting me, and all of that. But that's a little bit different in this case because, Free Speech Union, founded by Toby Young, etc., someone whose politics is probably diametrically opposed to mine in a lot of matters, apart from, of course, free speech. I would have never thought so. So I'm kind of, I will go back to this issue when I'm concluding my remarks. But I think what's happening here is, and John told me that this is the first time they're discussing the issue of free speech, freedom of expression, academic freedom from the perspective of the left, giving platform to people with perfect left-wing or at least liberal credentials. So I think what they're doing is really commendable. So I thank from the bottom of my heart. This is the first event of my book in London. And I'll talk, as I said, when I go back to this in my conclusion, you'll see how much effort we spent in the last 8 months to get this book covered in a mainstream, liberal, actually liberal right, this includes places like the Times, platforms, let alone a book launch or an event like this. So I really thank you, and I think what you're doing here is really important, at least as a first step to set the bridge. This is the concluding chapter of my book. I'm talking about building bridges, building coalitions. That's important. Now, I will just, in this introductory remaining 8 minutes, answer 3 questions. Why did I write this book? Well, I went through, I'm not going to go into the details of it. I was actually quite inactive between 2017 and 2023 for 5 years because of a personal trauma, quite a sad one, actually. And when I was slowly coming back to life in many ways, I was thinking of writing a book on far right and populism. That was my idea because it was the next, for me, it was the natural next step to take. I've written and edited 6 collections, 6 books on nationalism. That includes a textbook. That includes edited collections with to which my former supervisor, Professor Nirayuwal Davis, my mentor, my good friend, who is here today, contributed. That's how I learned gender, sex, and all of these things. But then, while I started reading these things, and because of the continuation of a number of events which led to my cancellation in June 2020, mainly in Turkey, but also, of course, with repercussions in today's world of, the butterflies and social media. When the flapping of the wings happened, people in Utah, University of Utah librarians were telling colleagues that I have never heard of not to use my book, Theories of Nationalism, by the way, which has nothing to do with these issues, with their students because I am this or that. So I noticed a process of radicalization. There is a word that Alice will be very familiar with. There's people now are jokingly talking about a moment and which has become a hashtag, peak trans. This is the moment where you realize that there is something wrong with the way in which issues of sex and gender are being discussed, especially in this country or in Anglo-Saxon countries. In my case, it was the left in general, identity politics in general, which I supported. Just for your information, I know, there are not many academics here. I was a strictly academic person, very little, a little bit involved in activism against the authoritarian Turkish government, but not much. And I was referred to as not only a left-wing, but also a postmodernist, of all things, And I was just trying to correct it to social constructionists, that I thought it was more acceptable. But then I started that I'm becoming radicalized, and I had my peak, not trans, but peak identity politics moment, or peak identitarianism moment when I was cancelled in 2020. And then I realized that there was something rotten, I'll use the proverbial Shakespearean quote, there was something rotten in the state of the left or progressive politics today. So that's why I decided to write a book on that. My cancellation was short-lived. Thank God I won a legal case and all of that. So I had the means, the platform to write a book. So the second question, so what does the book say? Well, that goes back to the first question. First, the first argument. I don't think what passes as identitarianism or progressive politics today is left. It is reactionary. There is no difference between the left and the right, so far as I see. I'm not talking about the left in general. I'm talking about left identitarianism. And that manifests itself mostly in my student days or postdoc days, etc. The main issues of discussion were nationalism, globalization, terrorism, conflict, and all. Today, the bone of contention is race and gender, much more so than nationalism, and which is kind of odd because back in the day, we were discussing whether nationalism is good or bad, what kind of nationalism, etc. Today, nationalism is taken for granted. In any case, national borders are. We've seen this during the pandemic. But race and gender are still contested issues, more so in the United States, especially when it comes to race. And in Britain, of course, around issues of sex and gender, as well as immigration. So that's what I realized. And first of all, the left and what passes as the left and the right are Siamese twins when it comes to their tactics and strategy. No debate, no. And by the right, let me just also define what I mean by the right. I'm talking about Trump, I'm talking about Ron DeSantis, who's passing laws, banning the teaching of anti-critical race theory, etc. That is Orban, these are the right people that I'm, talking about. Erdogan in my country of birth, etc., where, you go to prison for thinking a certain way. But then there's something else that I learned while writing the book, and this is the second point, the argument the book makes. The identity politics, what passes as identity politics today is not the original identity politics either. And that's where I found refuge. I studied Black feminist thought. Everybody thinks that the term intersectionalism was invented by Kimberly Crenshaw. It's not. She's the one who named it. Intersectionality comes from the Combahee River statement of Black feminist lesbian activists who coined the term in a manifesto in 1977. I started reading them. I discovered the work of Loretta Ross, the reproductive rights activists, and I was shocked because Loretta Ross became a reproductive rights activist and anti-racist activist, but we're talking about a woman who was raped when she was 7 or 8, then again at the year of 11 by by a relative. She got pregnant because at that point her scholarship depended on her having an abortion, and she refused to do so. She lost her scholarship. During her university years, she was gang raped, and then she was subject to this famous episode known as the Deacon something, this intrauterine device, which they use to experiment. They were giving out free these contraceptives in black majority universities, and a lot of women have lost their fertility because of these complications created by this. She started the class action. Loretta Ross at some point started going to prison to work with rapists. And then she worked with former Ku Klux Klan people. And I saw that Loretta was doing a workshop, online workshop. This was the time of the pandemic, which was called Against Call Out, which is another word for cancel culture, for calling in. Now, Robin DiAngelo, the EDI or DI people, are charging you around $30,000 for a 75 to 90 minutes talk. Loretta Ross, for 16 hours workshop, which is about building bridges, charged $20, which I took and I followed every evening because of the time difference. We were 300 people taking this course. Some people were asked to say their pronouns, but we were not obliged to. I said, I'm not going to tell you my pronouns. I don't care about pronouns. And I was welcome. So then I started to read more and more. I know the time limit, John, don't worry. And then I realized that, first of all, there is not only that the left is not the left. What passes as identity politics today is a betrayal of the original vision of Combahee River Collective, who actually invented the term in 1977. And three, then I thought, with this kind of Stalinist version of progressive politics, we cannot beat the right if we're talking about fighting against censorship, against DeSantis, against Trump. We are all accused of, just for being here, Alice, Alan, and I will be called, well, I've been called several times over, bigots, fascists, enabling the far right, this and that. You know the drill. I can offer you a list if you want, a glossary of terms. But the point is, they are the ones who are providing this ammunition. So then I wrote the book. I just first offered my critique. This is, the introduction is about how I got into this. Then I have a chapter criticizing right-wing identity politics, because let's not forget, Trump is white identity politics. That is also identity politics. Eric Kaufman, who is one of your advisors, is a classmate of mine. We are in civilized terms. We speak to each other. But, I tell him, I tell to his face, I wrote publicly that he's supporting white nationalism. He doesn't agree, but we don't have to agree. We fight. We simply fight. Verbally, nothing else, because we grew up together. We're the same age. We studied together at the LSE. So the third question, how could we do that? And that is where, that's also kind of an opening to Alan's comments, because he reviewed my book and I've read it. First, we need to expose the individualistic, narcissistic, middle-class nature of this new form of identity activism. This is in bed with neoliberalism. So if we, as leftists, and I'll leave the part about the critique of the weaknesses and limitations of my book to Alan, but if we are to fight against neoliberalism, that's not the way to do it. We need to find a way to talk to people. The starting point of my chapter 5 is very simple. The first thing we need to do is to listen. Not to talk, to listen. And then the second point that I'm making is, and that's where I will look with respect to Nira, to do real-life activism. Nira is the founder of one of the founders of Women Against Fundamentalism, fighting, knocking door to door. Talk to people, and this is, not do a hashtag activism. It's easy to be a keyboard hero or keyboard warrior. Just put a hashtag and that's it. If you're viral, you're gone. You made it. And that confers a moral value to you. You're virtue signaling. And 3, we should reclaim, and that's the thing, we should reclaim the left from what passes as the left today. That's my fight. That's what I will be doing. I was raised by, not only by Nira, but by a classical Marxist, Fred Holliday, who's sadly not with us. I believe in the value of class. The meanings have changed, but class is still important. Equality, social justice activism is still important. Common humanity is still important. So I need to be able to talk to, that's I had a very kind of, when he was visiting Barcelona, Jason Stanley, the Yale professor, some of you would know of him at least, he was calling, we had a little workshop and he was saying, Vox had just made, the far-right party in Spain, made the first big strides in the parliament. 3 million people voted for Vox, and he was saying, they're all fascists. And we tried to tell him, you can't tell people who voted for another party, including Social Democrats, in the previous elections, that they have become fascists overnight. That's not possible. Some are, but some aren't. And I need to have a vision, a story, a language to talk to these people. And that's why I'm here, actually. And that's my conclusion. Just to give you, and this is where I'm concluding, John, some of these are the platforms that this book was pitched in the last 8 months, and not only to the editorial boards, but to specific names. Guardian, The Times, The Sunday Times, The Observer, The New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, New Yorker, New York Magazine, New York Review of Books, London Review of Books, Chronicle of Higher Education, Unheard, yes, Unheard, didn't publish it, anything. The Atlantic, Open Democracy, New Statesman, I can go on. It's half a page. Nobody reviewed the book. And you know what the left's reaction? The woke left, what I don't want to use the woke left, the identity left's reaction to the publication of this book. This is my last words. This happened 31st of March, publication date of my book in Britain. 6 hours later, when Polity posted a tweet, I got this from, this is public, so I'm naming her, Alana Lantin, a race theorist, white, by the way. She wrote, what's wrong with Polity books? This is the second anti-woke book they are publishing. What is this? Too much race and black theory? Don't ask me what black theory is. I've never heard such a thing as black theory. I've heard as rainbow theory, but not black theory. Both sidism. Then the infamous Priyamvada Gopal jumps in, and she says, these are just embittered men who see themselves as real critical thinkers, blah, 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 blah. And then Alana Lantin says, this is genocidal politics. 6 hours after the tweet was posted, they haven't read the book, they haven't seen the book, they've just seen the title of the book. And then finally, Alana Lantin closing the conversation by calling a boycott on Polity. This happened on the 1st of April. So this is why I'm here, because, Free Speech Union, I don't agree with Toby Young. I don't agree with Douglas Murray. I skewed him, I grilled him in my chapter 2. But I am here because I'm offered a platform, and I told Jan, can I speak my mind freely? Can I criticize FSU? She said, do whatever you want. That's why I'm here. Thank you.
Thanks, Umut. Welcome to the club. And now I'll go to Alan. Oh, no, Alice. Sorry. Yes.
Well, I'd just like to start by thanking Umut for writing this book. It's such an important contribution because it's a discussion that we really need to be having on the left. So many people on the left will pretend that culture wars are somehow confected by the right wing and nothing to do with us at all. Well, we've got a problem. We need to own it. We need to talk about it. So thank you, Umut, for opening that discussion. It's been actually really hard for women on the left in the last few years. And it's been pretty shocking to see people who should know better, including high-profile Labour Party politicians, absolutely taking leave of their senses on the issue of sex and gender. So, for example, we've seen David Lammy, a frontbench shadow politician, saying that men can somehow acquire a cervix, possibly following hormone treatment. And this was in response to being asked, is it transphobic to say only women can have a cervix? We've had Dawn Butler, another Labour MP, saying that babies are born without a sex. Another quite radical claim. We've reached the point where we actually have to see it as real progress when Keir Starmer says that 99.9% of women don't have a penis. Because, he's getting there. He's nearly there. He's nearly there. So it would be really understandable, actually, for women, and not just women, but those of us who are materialists and believe in the distinction between truth and fiction, to just despair of the left and forget it. But particularly women in the UK actually have not despaired and left. Well, some have, but a lot have stood and fought. And as a result, there has been a real shift in the Labour Party line. It's been really slow and painful to achieve. It's been really frustrating. But that's been driven by incredible hard work by people like Women's Labour Declaration, for example. And also, there's been a huge amount of work across party lines. And I think that's also something that we can learn from, that on this issue, people have sort of dropped their party allegiances and just said, look, this is a serious problem. We need to just all get together and sort it out. So I do think that there's a left way back from woke. And I think there are really important lessons that we can draw from the gender-critical women's movement in the UK, because in the UK we've really been leading the charge on challenging gender identity theory. And by gender identity theory, I mean the theory that sex isn't real, that, babies are born without a sex, etc., etc. And that theory, I think, exemplifies the absolute worst excesses of anti-science and post-truth ideology. And that ideology should not be seen as a left-right issue. Anyone who cares about science and truth has to be on the same side on this one. Of course, women and men as well who've been fighting this are not exclusively on the left, but many of us are on the left. And I think that's been really helpful because it's made it much harder for people to portray the belief that sex is real and sex matters as somehow inherently a right-wing belief. And we've all been accused of genocide, and I've been accused of being a eugenicist and all sorts of stuff just for saying there are two sexes and we should collect data on sex. Doesn't sound like eugenics to me, but, of course, believers in gender identity theory have tried to portray British feminists as fascists, and we actually had Judith Butler in The Guardian saying that we're fascists. But it's actually been quite hard for them to push that line, because when you're attacking women like the Women in Women's Place UK, for example, who have lifelong histories of socialist and trade union activism, it really does seem quite obviously like a desperate smear to accuse them of being jackbooted Nazis. They just really, really clearly aren't. And I think that it really, over time, people start to get wise to the fact that that just shows how scared the identity politics crowd are of criticism from within the left, because then all they have is absolutely desperate smears and attempts to shut people down and demand no debate, because they don't have the arguments to have the debate. I think we do have some reasons for optimism in the UK, because the UK is not the US. So Umut talked about the fact that this isn't real left politics. These ideologies are the product of elite North American campuses. They are distinctively North American, and they're distinctively upper class, actually. And the US left, or what calls itself the US left, is very, very different in its traditions from the British and the European left. It lacks a socialist tradition, and actually it's that lack of a socialist tradition, I think, that makes identity politics appeal so firmly to people who see themselves as progressive in the US, because they're not interested in material inequalities. I think we can also be optimistic because the right in the UK is very different from the right in the US. The US is a nation that was founded by religious extremists, and frankly, it shows. We don't have a religious right here. We don't have a gun lobby here. And I think too often we see ourselves through through a lens of the US, and we're not like that. I actually think we're better than that. And they are a more violent, more unequal, more racially divided, more politically polarized society. The state of workers' rights and women's rights in the US is nowhere close to what we have achieved here. So we should not bow down to US cultural imperialism. And the left should be the first to say, no, let's not do that. We don't need their culture wars. So just to end on an optimistic note, I think that the UK women's movement has shown that by hard work, pragmatism, and sheer bloody-mindedness, we can actually move mountains and find a left way back from work.
Thanks, Alice. I think I will come straight on to Alan, and then we'll come back to Umut for any responses.
Yeah, I agree with Alice. This is a very important book. I'm glad it was published. So the first thing I'd like to ask is, who's going to read this book? I would hope that the people who would read it, first of all, are people on the left, fair-minded people on the left, who are attracted by woke ideas, but maybe are willing to rethink. And maybe some of them will be convinced by at least some of Umut's arguments and will change their way of thinking and change their ways of behaving. Or maybe some of them will not be convinced and they'll write articles explaining why they disagree with Umut. And either of those things would be positive. And I should say, something like that did happen back in 1996 when I wrote my critique of the postmodernist left as it was then. There was some of that positive reaction, but things were different in those days. The time frames were different. In those days, it would take you about a week to get an article published in a newspaper, or 6 to 12 months in an academic journal. Now, in less than 24 hours, you can organize a pile-on of 1,000 people on the internet. And so obviously that change has made things less amenable to rational discussion, unfortunately. I don't say that the discussion was perfect 25 years ago, but it was, I didn't risk anything like the cancellation that people risk nowadays. And so I'd like to mention 3 books that have framed my thinking about all of this. So one is the book of Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay, Cynical Theories, where they trace the history of the ideas that have led to the woke left, or as they would call themselves, critical social justice. And they trace its roots in postmodernist theory, and in particular, the idea that claims to utilize reason and evidence are actually nothing more than expressions of power. And when you have that idea, that authorizes you to disregard anybody's criticisms of your ideas, right? It authorizes you to evade reasoned debate. That's a real problem. The second book that enlightened me, I think, was the book by the psychologist Jonathan Haidt, The Righteous Mind. And so he explains that when it comes to moral issues, and that's some of the things that are at issue here, they're not purely academic issues, they're moral issues. Humans tend not to act like scientists and judges and jury members, that is to say, weighing evidence and trying to come to the most reasoned conclusion. They instead act like lawyers, trying to find the best arguments for their client. That is to say, trying to justify the moral intuitions that they've come to on purely emotional grounds. And again, that's a general human tendency that's in all of us, but we can struggle against it. But the postmodernist philosophy gives you a disincentive to struggle against it. And then the third book that I found enlightening was a book by the American linguist John McWhorter, Woke Racism. And he explains in great detail how woke ideology has many of the characteristics of a religion. A secular religion, to be sure, but a religion. Now, he's talking mostly about the ideology around race in the United States, but I think it's even more true if you look at the ideology around sex and gender here in the UK. It's incredibly religious. And again, that makes it very difficult to engage in rational conversations. We don't usually discuss with fundamentalists the details of the evidence of paleontology or Big Bang cosmology. I wish we could, but I understand that doesn't usually work. And so the question is, what will work in this situation? And the answer is, I don't know. I've given 3 reasons for pessimism. I don't want to be too pessimistic. I do hope that there are people, because I think there are fair-minded people who are tempted by woke ideas, but maybe haven't thought them through. To tell you the truth, until 3 or 4 years ago, basically until I met you, Alice, I didn't understand what the big deal was with, what bathroom people get to use, right? I just figured, this is the normal liberal thing to think, right? In the beginning, there was the civil rights movement. Then there was the feminist movement. Then there was the gay rights movement. These were all progress, right? Progress in human rights. Well, then there's the trans rights movement. And it took Alice and her colleague Judith Suissa to, make me see that things were more complicated. It wasn't just a simple continuation of those 3 good things. And so I suspect there were a lot of people like I was 3 or 4 years ago who could rethink some of these things. So that gives some optimism on the left. On the right, I would just say quickly, I want to second exactly what Umut said, that it's a great thing that the FSU has invited Umut and a panel of 3 leftists to be here. And that's a really positive thing. Okay, so now Umut primed you. I'm going to make a criticism of his book, one criticism. But it's not a criticism of anything he wrote. It's just a criticism of something that he didn't write, that maybe he now thinks he should have written. And so it is that he failed to analyze the class origins of woke ideology. And I would put forth the conjecture, I think it's something that sociologists should study more carefully, and I'm not a sociologist. I want to put forward the conjecture that woke ideology is a quintessential ideology of the professional managerial class. So it's the class of salaried mental workers who don't own the means of production, but who are not members of the traditional working class. Right? People like Alice and me and Umut, to tell you the truth, right? And woke ideology is a way for members of the PMC to portray themselves and actually see themselves, which is even more important, see themselves as virtuous defenders of the oppressed, while at the same time primarily serving their own class interests. And I think there are at least three ways in which woke ideology serves the PMC's class interests. The first is for the upper strata of the PMC, so that means people with managerial authority, especially people in corporate human resources departments. Woke ideology authorizes them to regulate the speech and behavior and aspirationally even the thoughts of the working class and subordinate members of the PMC. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, for anybody in the PMC who wants to play the game, woke ideology can serve as a trump card in intra-class competition for jobs and influence. And so, for example, in universities, at least in the United States, you're beginning to see it. They require diversity statements for job applicants. And in some cases, those are being used as a political litmus test to reject unsuitable candidates before their research and teaching are evaluated. That's really serious. And then the third thing is for the lower strata of the PMC, so people whose economic situation may be on a par with or even lower than some members of the working class that they come in contact with. So I'm thinking of compare an editorial intern or an adjunct lecturer with an electrician or a plumber, right? Woke ideology gives them psychological compensations. And I'd like to draw the analogy with the way that racism worked in the American South, and to a lesser extent in the North too. It gave poor whites a psychological compensation. It says, you know, we may be as poor as the blacks, but at least we're given the social deference that is appropriate for members of the superior race. And that's been written about a lot by scholars of racism. And I think that woke ideology gives the underemployed members of the PMC a similar psychological wage. It allows them to feel not only educationally superior to the working class, which they are, but actually morally superior, which they're not. And that's I think, a serious problem. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Well, brilliant. There's so much meat there for you all to respond to. I've no doubt you want to respond. So I was going to come back to Umut. I was going to have a bit more conversation amongst the panel, but actually, looking at the time, I think we're going to go straight out. It's so put your hands up if you would like to. Yeah, here we go. Right, we need somebody, Vinay, with the mic. Where's the other mic gone? Thank you. So you do have to speak into the microphone. Yes, green jumper over there, at the back there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Three very interesting talks. I wanted to ask something which flows from things that Alice and Alan said. And Alice said something about woke being a function of being an upper class view, particularly in American universities. There is an account of that which would describe it as a status marker or a luxury belief. That is to say that you espouse a particular set of views, perhaps about trans rights, both to associate yourself with high status people and to perhaps also to say, I am not affected by the places where this hurts, by women's refuges or prisons, to take two examples. And I would just invite your comments on that analysis.
Thank you. What we'll do is we'll take a few and then we'll come back. Shireen, so Vinay, in the blue shirt on the end. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for your input. Really enjoyed that. I wanted to ask what you think about the direction of environmental politics, because I think that's quite interesting. And I'm seeing a lot of crossovers with identitarian politics in terms of the kind of fundamentalism and the authoritarianism. But there is a materialist analysis to it, and it kind of comes from a different place. So it's not a class analysis, but there is a materialism to it, and there is a critique of kind of corporations, which is missing from the identitarianism. And yet often it's the same people, particularly with young people. And I'm thinking of university students. So I'm just wondering, the environmental politics comes from a different place, and it's typically been a much softer and has used techniques of nonviolent direct action, of consensus politics that have been all about talking and all about listening. So it's coming from a different place from the traditional left. And I'm seeing some convergences. So I just wonder what you think about the direction of environmental politics and where it does and doesn't converge with identitarianism.
Great, thanks, Shireen. I'll just stick over this side for now. So down the front here with the stripy T-shirt.
Hi, thank you. Listening to what you said made me think of something which I'd never thought about before, particularly what Alice said about the class structure. And I was thinking about Brexit, because it was the same sort of argument that people who voted for Brexit were lower class, they were idiots, and then the left and the right seemed to get completely mixed up, and I was wondering whether there's any parallels. That argument went, people are bored talking about it now, and now they're moving on to something else, which is, as this lady said about the environmental issues, it seems to be that people are now looking for reasons to look downwards and judge people.
Right, given that all of those three questions are on completely different things, albeit related, and we've opened up the topics to a huge range of things, let's come back to the panel. So, Umut, do you want to go first? Yeah? I don't mind. Okay, Alan, do you want to go first?
Well, the only thing I have to say is in response to the first question, I agree. Those are good points.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I also agree. I think it's kind of extraordinary the level of contempt for women in prison, in rape crisis shelters, those kinds of things. And the other point about that is that I think there's a really clear kind of hierarchy of human rights implied by that, which completely goes against the idea of universalism, that everybody has human rights, where some groups of people simply do not count and are subject to the most utter contempt. And that's horrifying to see, and it's particularly horrifying to see from people who see themselves as both left-wing and as sort of morally righteous.
But can I just ask both of you, though, why that boundary? Why the male-female, man-woman boundary? How is it that everybody, or lots of people in society, are suddenly kind of thrown up in the air by this, and either now forming an opinion on whether a man is a man or a woman's a woman and all the rest of it? So why that? Because I still find it really bemusing a lot of the time. What's your kind of quick answer to that?
I'm not sure I have a quick answer, but I do think... I think Alan said it's a religion, but it's interesting because it's a religion that nobody was brought up in. So you can I have a lot of sympathy for someone who has strong religious beliefs that they were brought up with. I would probably have those beliefs if I'd been brought up with them. But how do people who should know better suddenly decide that they don't know where babies come from? I mean, actually, I can't answer that. I'm sorry, Jan.
Any clue? No, no clue either. Well, if you don't know, how can anybody else? Lara, do you know? Well, let's just go to Lara.
Obviously, I talk about this and try to give you an explanation, but it would take too long. But all I want to point out is, if you can get people to at least agree on the surface, to go along with the construction of something, of such a category, such as sex, you can do anything. You can do anything. And as a paper, a research paper, a peer-reviewed paper published by the legal what is that legal gender project that got $500,000 of funding. This opens the door for age self-identification. I'm just leaving it at that.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I'll just cover everything in one go, starting with, Alan knows the answer because, we had lots of, we become kind of buddies in the last 15 days and talking and exchanging emails all the time. And I'll tell you, obviously, one thing, my partner was with me when I received the email and I thought it was a hoax. I said, Alan Sokal, this is a hoax. I mean, I shouldn't click on this email. And then I saw the subject line, review of cancelled. Okay, I mean, if it's a hoax, it's a well-designed hoax, so maybe it's worth a virus. And it wasn't. No, I mean, I told him, the reason why the 5th chapter lacks a solid analysis of class or any other issues. I mean, it was my book is published in a trade kind of section of polity, which is less academic and more for general audience. And to be able to publish the chapter 5, where I suggest my own solutions, I've spent weeks conversing or exchanging emails with my editors and all. And I gave the example when we were having a pre-event talk. I mean, even the simple word Alice used just in passing, universalism, was vetoed because it was too academic. So that's why I didn't go into it. But Alan, I'm onto it. I've been having some productive meetings in the last couple of days. So I think. There will be more to it. Now, the issue of class, of course, is very important. Laura and I've known Laura since she published the infamous Times Higher Education article on her research and then disappeared from sight or made to disappear from sight. And through, because I was working on my book and also, when I discovered that she's from Spain originally, so we've become also friends. We recently published on this. One of the things that I've discovered when she shared part of, whatever she has left of her data, because she lost access to her data, all the people who joined the massive cancel campaign, it's much worse than what I went through, that most people that I've seen, because, she was canceled for just doing research, okay? You may disagree with the findings of the research, but the research was never published. So we don't know whether I would disagree with her or not. And the point is, I can tell you from working with her, we've written together, I don't agree with some of the things she said. And, it took us like about 5 minutes to sort out this disagreement, move the paragraph, move on to the next one. Simple as that. We don't have to. Now, the thing is, all the people who joined, in my case too, but in her case is different because it's about ideas and ideologies. All the people who rushed to cancel her were senior female academics, all of them white. So if we're talking about, identities, white male, senior, and all of that, okay, they called me white. Like, I would just invite them to live in Sweden for 10 years as a Turkish person at that point. And that means, that shows you what whiteness means. But anyway, this is a class issue, who is more white, who is more senior, who is what, who is that, this and that. But then I will also add a note of optimism here with addressing Shirin's question. I'm lucky, I moved places due to my personal trauma. From Sweden, I went to Spain, and I've been teaching in a private university. The first year courses, like after 20 years, I went back to teaching Introduction to Political Science, about 80 students per year, 90, 20-year-olds. Spain is a very feminist country. There's no debating about it. Look what happened to Rubiales, rightly, by the way. That guy was, yeah. But anyway, Rubiales is the infamous Spanish Football Federation guy who kissed one of her players. Anyway. A lot of my students are activists. like working, like literally working with co-op. They go to co-op on their own expense. So they're bourgeois kids. It's a private university. It's 12,000 euros per year. So we're talking about quite well-off families, Catalan families. I provoked them, and in the seminars we discussed the two issues. Now the third one was added because of this environmental activism, and especially the rising profile, because, you know, in good or bad ways, of Just Stop Oil events, etc. My 19-year-old Gen Z students, who are very woke, so to speak, are very protective of their womanhood. They say no to single-sex, mixed spaces. I'm talking about women, okay? Men don't dare to open their mouth in class because, you know, if they do, my little activistas, I call them, they just say, you shut up, you're a man. So they dominate the discussion, but they say that, no, I mean, and Spain is like, nudity is not a big deal. You know, you sunbathe topless in Barcelona. This is not a big deal. But they don't want to share a space with a person who possesses male genitalia. Simple as that. Because they've been harassed, they've been raped. I know some of their stories and all of that. And the environmental activists, the kids, I know nothing about that apart from the fact that this is the most important issue that we should all be thinking about, writing about, and everything. They don't approve of all the tactics of Just Stop Oil. Blocking the roads, for instance, has been very controversial among my environmentalist 19-year-old students. And that's something that gives me hope because, you know, I'm all for civil disobedience. I'm all for nonviolent protests. But blocking a road when there's an ambulance, you know, that's something that my students didn't approve of. And that gives me hope. Because, I mean, well, there's one thing that I wanted to say to Alice as well, and I'll leave it just that, you know, it's the identitarians made a huge mistake around 2000, I think 17, maybe goes before that, because, you know, I'm illiterate when it comes to that. They messed with the wrong type of people. They messed with the wrong demographic, women.
Thanks, Umut. So I'm aware that the question we haven't come back to is the Brexit question, actually. And I know you write a lot about far-right populism in Europe. Hang on, I'll give you the mic. So I just wondered, over here, certainly a lot of people that I meet who have moved in the kind of pro-free speech direction, quite often the initial experience they had was of the silencing that happened around Brexit. But then also some people who were Remainers have realised retrospectively the silencing that went on around Brexit. So I just wondered what you think about that, because that fear of far-right populism has been, I think, used as a baseball bat looming over a lot of us. And that's certainly a lot of people on the left have said, well, that's the main thing we need to be concerned about. And so that's why we must, even if we think things, we mustn't say them, because we mustn't give any food to the right. So how do you deal with that?
I mean, one thing that stands out in pretty much all the research, because we know much more now, because the Brexit and Trump's election were 2016, lots of credible empirical research shows that there's only one socioeconomic indicator which is directly and positively correlated with these votes, and that's not class, that's education. The only predictor of, you know, who will vote for these, but it's changing. This is changing right now. So one of the things that I think, you know, and since Alan suggested some of the books that kind of enlightened him, in my case, it was Russell Hochschild's Strangers in Their Own Land. This was before. She is a fully solid, rigid, left-wing Berkeley sociologist, as left as you can get. She starts doing some research on Tea Party. Then she realizes that she needs to talk to them. So she goes to Louisiana, spends 5 years there. Like, she takes her husband with her, 5 years, thousands of pages of documents, and she comes back, writes the book. The book is published before or right after Trump's publication. It's one of the few books who predicted Trump's win because he's talking to Tea Party voters. And there, things get really complicated because, one, the class issue is very complicated. Some of them are working class who make their living out of the companies who are making a lot of money there. But there's a second complication. All of these companies in Louisiana is at that point was the 49th poorest state, and there are 50 states, so there was 49. The only way of making money was oil companies drilling, which were destroying the environment. So Arlie Russell Hochschild, with whom I just exchanged an email just to pay my respect, she said, look, I mean, it's not only like these people, first of all, they don't want handouts from the government, the American anti-state kind of thing. They also wanted those companies to remain in Louisiana. Half of them had cancer because of pollution, family members. And Arlie was saying, look, you're becoming cancer. I mean, it's not like, I mean, it's your daily life. And they said, no, we prefer to have a job. Maybe we can die of cancer and all of that. So these issues are so complicated, environment, class, the state's interference and all of that. And the only way to deal with it is what Arlie Russell did. She went there, she spent 5 years, went back to California. She was not the same person she was. And you know what? This left-wing professor, because of that book, by the woke identitarians, is called a far-right fascist.
Thank you. OK, let's come back out to the floor. Hands up. We've switched the microphone, but Saba, yes, down here. Thank you.
Umut said at the beginning that there was something rotten in the left, which I would say is hatred of the working class, which is quite an existential kind of rottenness. Is it not on? No, you just OK. And I mean, obviously, they say it's the white working class that's the problem. What they mean is the working class. I mean, when I was involved in the left back in the 80s, I would say that things were pretty bad then. I was probably in a minority of left-wing people who hadn't written off the working class. Most lefties I knew would say, they'd just vote for Thatcher. There was no kind of no idea how to inspire their own constituency, the people that they should be representing, and so they moved. The left moved towards embracing like minority groups and environmentalism instead of trying to represent working class people, and so they wrote the working class off as morally inferior and racist. And try to fight for the rights of minorities. The trouble is that when all minorities have got equal rights, when black people have got equal rights and so on, then you have to find another minority. And I think that the trans thing is the latest one, trying to find a minority group that hasn't got equal rights. When trans rights are human rights, what on earth does that mean, really? I think the way back for the left has got to be free speech for one thing. Challenging identity politics, which are totally divisive for ordinary people, and real democracy, and actually, trusting ordinary people rather than think, what we're seeing at the moment is that democracy is a bad thing.
Thank you. As it's my wedding anniversary, I'll go to my husband next. This is our date night.
It's true.
We met through politics, and we're going to keep that going.
I'm hoping the next 20 years will be better than the previous 20 years. Anyway, I'm going to suggest something a bit contrarian, I guess, but forget left and right. I'm sorry, but I don't see the point in trying to use this prism to understand what's going on. I can understand why people do it. So I hear people who you would say are on the right, try and explain what's going on in the world, and they say, oh, look, the left has captured the institutions, and the BBC is full of woke lefties, and you can see all these kind of treaties and explanations where people are trying to explain how people going to this university end up in this job, and that's kind of the right trying to explain it. But then we see the left version, Alice, I'm afraid, where you can't quite explain where your comrades have gone. And the only explanation you've got is the sort of, it's a far-right military-industrial complex ideology or something like that, and we don't quite know how it happened. And I think all of these categories, just, I don't see any value in it. We're not going to get anywhere with it. And I think, a bit like Stuart saying here, really, that we need to just come back to some foundational principles that we know are crucial in this particular era. Democracy, he mentioned, is one of them. It doesn't matter where you stand on Brexit, they try to overturn the vote. I mean, that we should have been... I know that the trans issue is really important at the moment, and a lot of feminists and GCs and all the rest of it, and I'm quite happy to go to Hyde Park and join the debate, but I have to think, you know, some of you lefties weren't on the right side on Brexit, you know, so we need to say democracy, right? All of us, we need to, whatever political side we come from, we should say democracy number one. Science, I think science, we've got to all uphold science. You shouldn't be able to, you know, Roisin Murphy, you know, you shouldn't be able to say, I don't think puberty blockers are a good idea. And that should be a debate. You should be able to debate something like that. Now, it may turn out they are a good idea. I'm open-minded about it. It's possible that it is the best thing for some kids. But at the end of the day, the most important thing is that we're talking about it. And science, and then finally, free speech. I think free speech, freedom of thought. So I do... Like Umut, you kind of made a point a couple of times of saying, I don't agree with Toby. And yeah, fair enough. I'm an old lefty, you know, like Stuart, you know, comrades back in the day. Lots of things I don't agree on. But who else set up the Free Speech Union? You know, you've got to say, right, in this day and age, this is crucial. Forget left and right. Free speech, freedom of thought, science, democracy, these are the things that we should champion. And I loved what you were saying about, you know, this is the beginning of something. The coming together and talking about this stuff. That's what we need to be doing. Forget left and right.
And that is why I married him. Okay, chap down the front here. Yep.
Hello.
Me? Yeah, you had your hand
cool.
up.
Yeah, cool. So I wanted to say something about a very similar topic that he just spoke about, which is that I don't know. Like on just yesterday, there was something on FSU's Instagram about the Oxford University trans inclusion policy, and there was a discussion about left and right, and I was commenting on it, and I got back a whole bunch of vitriol, and I don't know. I've done more than dabble in the left in London, and I found it to be kind of a largely hopeless cesspit of like Trotskyism and whatever. So, and I've more or less like abandoned the identity of being like a leftist, having, you know, although I do still have all of the knowledge about like Marxist history and stuff like that. But and as a practical matter, I think I've realized that it's not worth clinging to these terms of left and right, even though they do have meanings, other than as a matter of like academic rigor. I mean, like, for example, there's one of the themes that we talk about is like population control. Or the rulers want to control the population and stifle reproduction. And that's something that Marx wrote about. That's not a communist idea. That's Malthusianism, right? I mean, there is a such thing as zooming out and looking at history, like wokeism, feminism. I mean, like wokeism is not a leftist thing. So as an academic question, I think, like, you know, there is a sense of reality. These concepts do have histories, and it is worth standing up for them if you're going to be, like, I suppose, pedantic and academic. But what I've realized in practice is that it's kind of so hopeless. These terms have, in practice, in common usage, really lost their meaning so that they're not useful. And unless you want to be like a one-man army educating people about the history of Marx and Malthus and the true origin of like population control or whatever, like, you know, it's just a losing battle. And so I think leftism has, the idea of left has taken on, you know, synonymousness with wokeism. It kind of does, when people talk about leftists, I no longer find it useful to try to stand up and salvage that idea of leftism.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. If you just want to pass the mic there to the corner.
So thinking about the practical question, is there a way back? One thing that I don't think has come up so far is the strand of utopian thinking that's now happening on the left. So someone said earlier, if a man can have a baby, you can do anything. You know, if a woman can get prostate cancer, anything could happen. You know, if I could menstruate this month, wow, you know, that's a brave new world. And I come across a lot of people on the left, on the liberal left, who seem to think all these things are actually prospects. You know, notoriously a few weeks ago, somebody said he wanted to be the first trans female to have an abortion. Do people remember that? There are people who seriously entertain these views. This makes them perfect for grievance politics, because these are things that can never be satisfied. So that leaves you with 100 years of activism. And I think one way we could tackle these people is by trying to grasp this problem of utopian thinking and demands that can never be satisfied. And I think that could pull the kind of activist rug from under their feet.
That's a really interesting point. Thank you. Yes, I don't know who you're pointing at. Oh, Helen. Okay. Yes, great. In that case, let's go to Helen Pluckrose. Sorry, I didn't see where you were earlier.
Okay, I just wanted to raise a point of practical disagreement with the gentlemen who were saying that leftism has no great use as a concept anymore. And I think perhaps in philosophical terms or in public discourse, there's some truth in that. But in practical reality, we have two parties, and we need to vote for one of them, and they enact policies. At the moment, in the conversation that we're having, we're seeing the three strong currents, which can be described as on the left. So they're the liberals, the socialists, and the identitarians. Now, these are in tension with each other. And what I would like the panel to think about is, if we want to bring the left back. I mean, Umut was saying that identity politics can sometimes be useful. When Alice is speaking about women talking about their experiences, she's saying the same thing. The problem sometimes with liberals like me is that you can be too much focused on the individual and the universal and miss the groups in the middle. And there's that tolerance thing where people say a liberal is someone who won't take their own side in an argument. The Marxists can sometimes be accused of class reductionism. They can often think that if we just sort out economic equality, everything else will fall into place. And the identitarians seem to think that by changing our discourses and getting various identity groups in various places, everything else will fall into place. But we've got those three things there. We've got all of those different elements. Is there a way that if someone like me, a liberal, can think, well, my framework is liberal, but I'm on the left. Am I paying sufficient attention to social castes and to group interests? Is this disadvantaging anybody? Can a Marxist think, well, I'm focusing on socioeconomics, but what's happening with freedom of belief and speech? Am I getting in the way of that? Is this going to be affecting other groups? If the identitarian can be brought, which is a bit difficult at the moment, to think, okay, I have a particular interest in this group, but am I being illiberal? Am I, in fact, using a capitalist corporate framework which is damaging people? Can we find a way as a left to make it a cohesive concept where those three currents can actually be brought together? Because I think a lot of the mess and conflict we're seeing coming from Starmer at the moment is that he's trying to appease all of these different groups all at the same time. So if we're to be cohesive, can we think like that? Sorry, that was rather long.
Thank you, Helen. Okay, I'm going to come back to Alice first to answer that one directly.
Well, I'm going to start with your husband, Jan. I just want to say that it's my wedding anniversary as well. Isn't that spooky? That's my husband over there. Exactly. And yeah, I mean, just to say that I think absolutely science, free speech, and democracy are the starting point, and I think that's the starting point for everyone on the platform. So I hope that was obvious, that all of those values are, of course, much more important than left and right. So, yeah. And I'm sorry, I got slightly lost in Helen's question, so I'm going to hand over.
I think it's just question, is there some kinds of way in which there can be a coming. I mean, are you talking about a kind of coming together on the left while maintaining the left, Helen, or do you think that that requires a dialogue with the right? Okay, so I know you haven't got a microphone, so I'm going to thank you. No, that's my fault, not yours. That's. I just wanted to just clarify. So, do you want to say a bit more about that, Alice? About where you see what might come next? What might be? I mean, what's the most kind of exciting thing you've seen coming out of the experience you've had over the last few years in terms of a kind of broader politics potentially?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are seeing people coming together across sort of partisan divides, and we've definitely seen that in the women's movement. And it's actually really exciting, and it's really fun to find yourself working with all sorts of people that you wouldn't ordinarily be working with. So I think that's a really energizing experience, and I hope that that's something that everyone who's been involved with that will sort of carry with them and learn from. I think, I mean, you're talking about this in terms of liberalism versus Marxism, etc. And I think actually there are more fundamental dividing lines. Again, going back to the science point, do you believe in empirical evidence? Do you believe that the truth is out there, or are you purely ideologically driven? And that's not a left-right divide. That's a very different kind of divide. And I think it's incumbent on all of us who believe in science, truth, reality, and I do think the values of free speech and democracy are wrapped up and bound up in those as well. And we do need to work across partisan lines to defend those values.
I'd like to hear what Umut would like to say about Helen's question.
Well, that's a very... Jan told me that there might be a moment of reckoning, and I think that's the moment of reckoning. She told me, and I didn't ask her for permission, but it's not a very kind of, yeah. She told me that if you mess with Toby, you'll get a backlash. So I guess I shouldn't have said that but that's the moment of reckoning, okay?
No, I didn't mean...
I know.
I didn't mean you get a backlash from Toby. I meant that other people would defend Toby.
That's exactly my point. So I want to go back to Stuart and your husband. What's your name? I don't... Mark. Stuart and Mark. I'm sorry. I mean, woke bashing is nice, and that's what I've done in the book. But I started with, yes, I agree with all your points in principle. Yes, we should challenge identity politics as it is today. Yes, democracy. Yes, science, yes to utopian thinking, but don't you think that what is the right is doing? What about cancel culture that comes from the right? If you Google free speech, huh? Oh, I'm sorry. If you, there are people who are being cancelled for their pro-Palestine views, for allegedly supporting Antifa, etc., etc. I mean, the numbers that, if you read only the Daily Telegraph and Daily Mail, you won't see them, but it happens. And not to mention the examples that I referred to in my introduction, United States. There are people like Matthew Goodwin who argue that there is a woke takeover, critical race theory takeover in Britain. That's not the case. I'm sorry. So if we're going to criticize identity politics, let's do it on both sides. Because it's not on both sides. Oh, it's not on. Well, that's the point that I think we should agree to disagree. It is on both sides. Maybe if you focus only on the elite institutions, universities, culture, and BBC, you see it there. But I mean, it's not that. It's not only that, at least. So I was talking about the beginning, and I'll go back to. I mean, it's a big. If it's a walk, it's a path that we should walk together. We should come closer to each other. I made a step because I believe that I should start criticizing my own tribe, because this is where I feel I belong to. But I mean, I spend a whole chapter criticizing the anti-immigration views of people like Douglas Murray and all of that. I'm not going to be having an argument about certain areas of London are smelling like Pakistan. That's where I draw the line. Immigration is a problem. That's another issue. But saying that, these people are coming, nobody's criticizing Ukraine. I mean, Matthew Goodwin was cheering on Twitter when Hong Kong was sending here 500,000 people. The same Matthew Goodwin who hates Muslim immigration. So there's, let's not just, yes, there are serious problems with the left today, or with what passes as the left, but that doesn't mean that the right is like, only about free speech and all of that. No, there's much more to the right that we should I'll tell you to do something. I did it before coming here, right? And this is partly due to the woke thinking, woke dominance. So I give you that as a beginning. Google Free Speech Union and cancel culture. If you find an example of cancel culture in the first 10 pages of Google about the right-wing cancellations, I'll apologize.
I'm going. Well, you didn't have your hand up earlier. So yeah, now you do. Alan.
I just want to briefly answer your challenge. So there. There was a series of 3 eloquent articles earlier this year by Kanan Malik in The Observer, where he points to examples where the Tory government has vetoed, so certain experts were asked to talk to the civil service about certain topics within their area of expertise, and the Tory government vetoed them as speakers to the civil service because they disagreed with government policy on other issues, not even the issues they were going to speak about. So that's a precise example. And Kanan is very clear in these articles that he is opposed to leftist cancel culture, and he's also opposed to conservative governments' cancel culture. And by the way, I don't think we need to weigh which is more dangerous. They're dangerous in different ways, right? I mean, in the United States, you can see there is the quote left, the woke. I have to put left in quotation marks for all the reasons you said. The quote left controls a lot of cultural institutions. The so-called conservatives, who are not conservative at all, control a lot of state governments. And God forbid may control the national government next year if we're not careful. And they're both dangerous in different ways.
Okay, thank you, Alan. Right, if you keep it fairly short, because we're right at the end, but thank you.
Okay. I asked for examples of when the right cancels the left, and you just gave me examples of what you disagreed with what the right is saying. You have not given me any examples of when the right cancels the left. The right just does not do it. So please, from your left-wing views, tell me, when does the right cancel the left? Does not happen.
Well, you could say things like, Richard Tice was calling for EU flags to be banned from the proms this week. That was the first response. It's not that instinct doesn't exist on the right at all. I mean, I agree. The weight is massively in the other direction, but that's not to say that there is not worth examining something of those tendencies on the right, is there? Because otherwise, it's just a kind of a victory parade, which doesn't really open up a dialogue. But have you got some examples now, Umut? Okay, well, I'll tell you what we're going to do, because that's another massive pot to open. So we're going to finish in about 8 minutes or so. So we'll take 2 more questions. Yeah, thanks, Sab. So if these 2 people here can get to speak.
I'm completely mystified by everything that all of you have said. Now, I don't encounter wokeness, whatever it might be in everyday life, but I do encounter it in the... Hold on. I encounter it in the pages of the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph. Now, you're all tremendously clever people from a very rarefied part of the world, higher academics, and you've read lots of books that other people actually haven't read, and you're concerned with arguments that most people have never crossed. Now, here's a thing. You haven't quantified anything. You haven't given big political examples. How many woke people are there? Why should we care? How, in any way, does wokeism affect my life as a person who's neither an academic nor a politician? It's tiny stuff. Do you know how many people have crossed from female to male and male to female in the census? You're supposed to know about this stuff. How many have done it?
0.2%.
Yeah. How many of you have been cancelled, and what happened?
Well, you can go and research that because...
How many of you have been cancelled, and what exactly happened?
Okay.
It's terribly exotic, and it's absolutely... It's very exotic, and it's absolutely tiny.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This always happens towards the end, doesn't it? So I'll tell you what we'll do is we'll have a final question here, and then we will come back to the panel, and you can share your cancellation examples if you want to. Otherwise, you can sum up in different ways.
Thanks for the mic, and thank you everyone who's been on the panel and all the work that you've done. I speak as a white working class mother and grandmother. I'm not a public speaker. I'm definitely not an academic. I am a lesbian, and I can say that our lives have been made hell, and the institutions have all been taken over. The hospitals and the schools where the children are being taught the most appalling, horrific stuff. And I know this is all about left and right, but to me what happened during the pandemic was that they were working out how much they could control us, how many of us would wear a mask, how many of us would go time and time again and take these poisonous jabs. If anybody wants to know what's going on, you need to read Jennifer Billick, because what's happening is totalitarianism. It's capitalism gone mad. Capitalism looks at a mountain and they see coal. Capitalism looks at a woman, they see a prostitute, and they see somebody willing to carry a baby for someone else for cash. They see surrogates. They see spare parts. Please read what Jennifer Billick has to say about this. 15-minute cities, our banks being closed down. Very soon, the gates are going to shut, and we are going to have no way out. Our phones are, I love my phone. I gave my phone into Samsung to repair, and I felt like I'd given away one of my children. But the thing is, our phones are enslaving us. And very soon, they will have the ability to shut down every single person in the world. They know exactly who we are, who we're talking to, what we're about, and what we own. So please, all this academic fucking about, please get on with it and look at what's actually happening here. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I have to say, I object to any suggestion that our panellists are purely academics who are sort of... I know, I don't mean, yeah, but I mean the previous two comments. No. You know, because I think that these people have done a huge amount, going back to when Alan originally wrote his paper, which absolutely blew a kind of challenge to postmodernism into the popular domain, not just in academia. It mattered to us as a, you know, rubbish undergraduates in academia. We clocked that was going on, but it was also all over the newspapers. It really mattered. And similarly, what Alice has done and what Umut's doing with the book, these are interjections in the public domain, and they are really not just kind of academic, esoteric conversations that nobody's interested in. I mean, look around the room, look at our 11,000 members. look at the 400 people online, look at the number of people who are concerned about these issues. I really, really would challenge that idea that somehow this is some kind of airy-fairy conversation that's irrelevant to most people. Anyway, that's me. I'm going to, no, I've now forgotten the order in which we spoke. We just come back along this way, shall we? So Alice, do you want to sum up in whichever way you wish to?
Well, it's true that there are very few trans people, but isn't it amazing, therefore, how dramatically they've affected public policy, or not them, but actually trans activists have affected public policy to the detriment of other groups, including women and children, and not democratically at all. Because if you look at public opinion, if you ask people specific questions, if you ask a very vague question, do you support trans rights? Of course, people will say yes, because they do. But if you ask them, do you think males should, for example, be able to play in women's sports? They'll say no. And yet, sports bodies have gone along with that. You know, there are so many examples in pretty much every aspect of public life. You asked for my cancellation story. Well, I was no platformed for advocating that we should collect data on sex. I also think we should collect data on gender identity as well. I wasn't saying we shouldn't collect data on that. I was just saying we should also collect data on sex, and that they're two distinct concepts. An entire event at City University that was organised by National Centre for Social Research and the Office for National Statistics were heavily involved. That entire event, which would have been an opportunity to discuss data collection on sex and gender, was cancelled because they didn't want to platform me, and they thought that rather than disinviting me, it would be far more subtle to just cancel the entire event, and then I wouldn't guess what was going on. Well, unfortunately for them, I did. And anyway, the point isn't what happened to me. The point isn't individuals being cancelled. The point is people being too frightened to speak about matters of important public policy significance. And if you don't understand why that matters, then read the Cass report.
Well, I don't have much more to say. I just want to thank the FSU for organizing this. I mean, again, I think, you know, it's an organization that at least has a kind of right of center aura, and the fact that you invited 3 leftists to be on the panel here is a very positive thing, and I want to thank you for that.
Thank you. Yes, I think I disrupt the right of centre aura in the FSU. That's partly my role, I think.
Okay, can I have the name, your name, please? Gordon and? Me? Yes. Morven. Morven, okay. To Morven, I mean to all of you actually, and I think Peter, right? Yes. Okay, Peter. To Morven, that's what I say in my book, Get Real. Okay, so I'll give you a free copy, please. This is my gift from not because, you know, you know, I'm not politically correct. It has nothing to do because you said you're working class, and I'm sure you can afford to buy the book, but I want to give it to you, okay? Now, when it comes to Gordon and Peter, sorry, you sent me your email when I was on holiday. I didn't have internet reception, so I didn't reply to your email. Both Peter and Alan, you're both living in a bubble. I'm sorry. With all due respect, I will reply to you in the same tone, not without anger, but with excitement. You're both living in a bubble. You want examples? Professor's Watch List in the United States, which was making a list of left-wing professors, and then in a McCarthyist way, and getting, you know, to get rid of them. And actually that led to splits within heterodox academia founded by Jonathan Haidt. You want to know how many, just between June 2021 and June 2022, how many books were banned? According to PEN America's Index of School Book Bans, 2,532. 40% of them had themes that related to LGBTQ issues. The remaining are race, etc., etc. Individual examples, David Miller, who was hounded off from his work, I don't remember which university, for having supposedly pro-Palestine views. Then there's Nicole Hannah-Jones, who was denied tenure. Of course, she was too famous, so she found another job. Then there's Cornel West, whose position in Harvard was not extended because of his pro-Palestine, too left-wing views. And you don't see many of them because they happen behind closed doors. The donors don't cancel you just like that by sending a tweet. They deal with it in the university boardrooms. And Peter, you think that that doesn't exist? Just go to Academics for AFAF.org, Academics for Freedom of Academic Freedom. Just and you know, it's a very anodyne article, Times Higher Education tomorrow. I counted in 1 year 60 cases of cancellations. I checked all of them, and you can find the links there. 60 cases of cancellation, out of which 25, out of 60, and that includes right and left, okay? There are 3 cancellations in the 60 of the Israeli ambassador to London. He wanted to go to give a talk at the LSE, and you know, the pro-Palestine students said that this is a Zionist, etc., etc. So this includes both right and the left. Out of 60, 25, so we're talking about 50%, are women cancelled for their gender-critical views. And I'm sorry, there's a friend of mine here who's sitting, who lost her job for doing a research on that. And she has 2 kids. So you have to move out of your bubble. Let's just say, why am I speaking? That's what I couldn't reply to you because I wanted to write you a long reply. What happened? Well, no, Peter, what happened to our organization? Peter, what happened to the talk that you were going to organize with Ash Sharkar about my book? You never replied to my email for 3 months.
Okay, before this gets like into some personal verbal punch-up, can I just, this has been a fantastic evening. From my point of view, this is the kind of thing I love doing, wedding anniversary or no wedding anniversary. So can we just thank our panelists? I do urge you to buy a copy of Umut's book. It is really fascinating, and I think you'll really, really, really enjoy it, and you'll find it extremely stimulating no matter which direction you're coming from. And also buy Alice's book, because it's so important, and use the flyer to get the discount code. And then finally, we can go to one of 2 pubs. We probably will flood the small pub on the corner if we all try and go there. That's called the Queen's Larder, but that's very nice. And then further around the corner to the right, if you go out of here, right is the Queen's Larder on the corner. Right again is the Swan, which is a slightly larger pub, and that's also got outdoor space. So do head there. Keep your tempers. Learn to love one another across the left-right divide. And we'll see you at the next event. Thank you.